On December 4th, 1941, the biggest story of the year is printed. The Chicago Tribune, a newspaper known for its opposition to President Roosevelt's policies, both foreign and domestic, is publishing a shocking exposé. It claims to have discovered secret documents, revealing the administration's true intentions for the ongoing European war. While wearing the mask of neutrality in public, the administration has been secretly involving America for war against Germany. While claiming to do everything possible to keep America out of foreign entanglements, they have been doing everything possible to backdoor America into war. And now, the smoking gun is here. Known as Rainbow 5, the leaked war plan reveals rearmament figures, battle plans, and an overall strategy for deploying United States forces to Europe no later than 1943.
And it went on to say that the United States would be raising an army of something like 10 million to go to war and defeat Germany. It was not presented as a contingency plan. It was presented as a plan that was going to be executed.
When asked about its authenticity by the press, the government neither confirms nor denies it. Unpatriotic is the charge leveled against the paper. It is just a contingency plan, one official says. America must examine all possible military options, whether they are at war or not. That is the official line being put out in order to defuse the explosive charges of the Tribune. 3 days later, the biggest story of the year becomes the second biggest. Japan launches a surprise aerial attack against American naval bases at Pearl Harbor. America is no longer neutral. They are now at war with Japan, and 3 days later, Nazi Germany. With Roosevelt declaring the 7th of December a date that will live in infamy, the Rainbow 5 story is all but forgotten. Overlooked by many historians, this war plan is perhaps the most important document in American military history. Inside these pages are numerous requests that call for a massive increase in both men and supplies. One of the most important recommendations is the need for a long-range bomber. One that protects American cities from possible German attack if Britain and the Soviet Union fall to Nazi aggression. Known as AWPD-1, this Air Corps addition to Rainbow 5 is where American air power evolves. As the United States begins rearming itself on an unprecedented scale, the use of long-range bombers is arguably the most important factor in winning the Second World War, both in Europe, the Pacific, and beyond. This is the history of how Rainbow 5 and its call for long-range bombing is born, how it became the product from decades of strategic thinking, how America's geography shaped its need for a weapon of this nature, and how, as the country sat on the sidelines for more than 2 years in a state of neutrality, they carefully observed the new way wars were being fought. What designs are given the green light, and what designs are rejected? This is the story of Rainbow 5. On September 3, 1939, the European powers of Britain, France, and Germany are now at war. The entire world watches as events unfold. German troops, with Soviet assistance, easily destroy Polish forces. With each passing month, the Nazi war machine appears invincible. As Norway and the Low Countries are captured, next, the unthinkable happens. France surrenders to Germany, declaring Paris an open city. Now, the only country standing in the way of complete Nazi domination of Europe is Britain. As the world watches in shock as German troops march down the Champs-Élysées, one important development in military strategy is evident. Air power is now the key to success. It is air power that completely demolishes Poland. It is air power that provides cover for the German forces as they bypass the infamous Maginot Line. It is air power that gets the Nazis to Norway, leaving the British humiliated at Narvik. And it is air power that saves England by the skin of its teeth. Specifically, the bomber is now the weapon of choice. With the capability of penetrating the enemy's defenses and pulverizing both their industries and civilian populations, this aircraft is both feared and sought after. During the Blitz, former Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's prophecy that the bomber would always get through is now here.
Certainly the Luftwaffe played an extremely important part in the opening German victories of World War II. And when we say opening victories, we don't mean the first 6 months, we mean the first 2 years, in which it looked like a German victory was very much in the offing. The German Air Force was very skilled at the tactical level, that is cooperation with the ground forces. It was extremely successful at the operational level of war, the intermediate level, that is carrying out campaigns against enemy supply lines, for example, feeding troops and men to the front.
With its deadly arsenal, Germany is carving up not only Western Europe, but now its former ally, the Soviet Union, with a surprise attack in 1941. With a barrage of planes, the German military reaches the suburbs of Moscow. One thing is clear to both neutrals and belligerents: whoever has the most planes prevails.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral has a right to take account of facts. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or close his conscience.
While these earth-shattering events take place for almost 2 years, the United States stays out of the war, based on a philosophy dating back to their first president of staying out of foreign entanglements. The vast majority of the American public wants nothing to do with another European war.
Following Armistice Day, American public opinion really turned sharply against what had happened. And you saw, even when we went into the war, opinion had changed around quite rapidly. So America no longer wanted to be part of this European scene again. They realized that things had not quite turned out as they wished it had. The Treaty of Versailles, the backbiting, the acrimony there, made Americans wonder what they had fought for.
If another war develops in Europe, should America take part again? No. 95%. We the people had spoken. 19 out of 20 of us said, include us out.
The bitter aftertaste of the war to end all wars has made Americans think twice before succumbing to jingoistic rhetoric.
I don't know if isolationism had been the American default in foreign policy, but certainly there was a reaction to what had happened in World War I within America, that troops had gone over in the hundreds of thousands, the war had been won, but the peace seemed quite unsatisfactory. Partially as a result of that, and partially as a result of extremely tight budgets, of course, in the 20s and especially in the 1930s, the U.S. Army was an incredibly shrinking military force in the interwar period.
Over the past decade, Congress passes several neutrality laws to make sure the same mistake of 1917 is not repeated. For those favoring American entry, it is a steep hill to climb to reverse this trend. Even if public opinion changes, the American military is in no condition to fight.
The United States, prior to Pearl Harbor, prior to our going into World War II, was militarily a very weak country. It ranked 17th in the world behind that great power, Romania.
With quantity a must for any world power, the United States must catch up in order to make a difference. Even more concerning is the state of America's aircraft industry. Ranked just 40th in size, production does not exceed 2,000 planes until 1939. That is half the size of Japan's, a quarter of Germany's, and a fifth of the Soviet Union's. For the first months of the war, America's specialty is sewing machines, not airplanes. However, as hostilities commence in Europe, American aviation production spikes, with foreign orders going through the roof, as well as an increased demand by their own military. America's aircraft industry is experiencing an unprecedented boom. Since the darkest days of the Depression, manufacturers are turning the corner. Business is once again reaching pre-1929 levels. The rest of the world is realizing that the United States, with its large population, has an almost limitless industrial capacity. There is one problem. American law prohibits the sale of these goods to any belligerent nation. This neutrality legislation proves to be a thorn in the side of both the emerging military-industrial complex and their sympathetic leader in the White House. In the meantime, they must find creative ways to evade these laws.
We are at one of the world's few unfortified frontiers between Canada and the US. Canadian troops guard their side as another batch of American-built bombers is coming over to help us in the war. Under the neutrality law, no US pilots may fly into Canada, and no Canadian may fly into the US. So there's nothing for it but to tow the planes over the line. But that's as good a way as any, as long as we get the planes.
In the long term, what these companies need is for their president to take a stand and eliminate this red tape.
I have asked the Congress to reassemble in extraordinary session in order that it may consider and act on the amendment of certain legislation, which in my best judgment so alters the historic foreign policy of the United States that it impairs the peaceful relations of the United States with foreign nations.
Against the currents of public opinion, the president is able to amend current laws by allowing a provision calling for cash and carry. If a nation wishes to purchase American military goods and provides their own transportation to bring them back, they may do so. Without question, this favors the sea nations of Britain and France, and not the land power of Germany.
Franklin Roosevelt initiates a number of measures to aid the Allies. The Lend-Lease program, which at first is to trade American destroyers for bases in the Western Hemisphere with Britain, to repeal provisions of the Neutrality Act so we could sell supplies to the Allies. Then a cash and carry provision, which again stretches neutrality because the only people who can really cash and carry are the Allies, are Britain. Germany cannot. Then you see American convoys, destroyers, providing protection for the provisions which are war supplies, war materiel, which is being carried to Britain. Again, a very strange definition of neutrality.
With this new direction in government policy, there are those who make their displeasure known.
Will we say farewell to George Washington's national policy of no foreign entanglements and acclaim Mr. Roosevelt's international policy of meddling in European power politics? Will we forget the course of events which led us into the last World War? Promises to keep us out of it. Pressure of propaganda to get us into it.
Despite opposition, America's neutrality laws are eased. As a result, aircraft production skyrockets to new levels as demand exceeds capacity. During most of the 1930s, manufacturers produced largely civil aircraft. Now, with orders in excess of 10,000 by July of 1940, production stalls at just 250 per month the following year. The space and facilities necessary for this level of output are inadequate at the present time. Understanding his country's lack of preparedness, as well as secretly trying to involve America into war, President Roosevelt issues an important declaration. For the aircraft industry, as well as an emerging military-industrial complex, it is their Magna Carta.
I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year.
President Roosevelt had a firm grasp of the importance of air power, and in a sense, under a program proposed such as Rainbow 5, the United States would become a military air power.
As Nazis gain ground on the continent of Europe, with Britain's very livelihood threatened, the United States seems the next likely target. If Hitler is able to gain control of the Azores, Iceland, or the Cape Verde Islands, American security is directly threatened. The possibility of German infiltration into South America is a propaganda theme already echoed in America's theaters.
Already in Brazil, there were over 1 million Germans who lived exactly as they did in Germany. 1,200 German schools with Nazi textbooks and Nazi teachers. Nazi newspapers. Hermann Goering glider clubs had been established. Also in Brazil, there were 260,000 Japanese taking orders from Japan. In Ecuador, within easy bombing range of the Panama Canal, German airlines had been established. German pilots were reserve officers of the Luftwaffe. The German transport planes had bomb racks already built in. In Argentina, German athletic clubs similar to the Hitler Youth movement had been organized exclusively for Germans. Here was a fifth column ready to take over.
No longer do the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans provide a buffer of security. With the rapid advancement in aviation technology, as well as the possibility of the Nazis gaining a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, their bombers could soon be flying over America's cities. This possible scenario is frightening to both military leaders and the president.
If Bermuda fell into hostile hands, it would be a matter of less than 3 hours for modern bombers to reach our shore. From a base in the outer West Indies, the coast of Florida could be reached in 200 minutes.
Despite these warnings, a majority of Americans are not convinced. Hemispheric defense is one thing, but actively seeking war in Europe by choosing sides is another.
There was a great hangover of isolationism from World War I, which continued into World War II as World War II began in September 1939. So that even before you get to Pearl Harbor, in the months before that, you're seeing opinion polls where 75, 80% of the American public do not want to enter the war against Germany, even though anti-Nazi sentiment is very large and we're basically in a shooting war with, undeclared shooting war with Nazi Germany. Americans still want to keep out.
As Roosevelt calls for massive rearmament, including the building of thousands of planes, there is a backlash.
Franklin Roosevelt had a strong sense that one way or another the United States was likely to be drawn into World War II. However, this was not something that he could readily say in his public statements to the American public because he would be interpreted as a warmonger, and the isolationist sentiment was fairly strong in the United States prior to the war, and most people preferred that the country remain in a neutral position.
Non-interventionist groups begin to spring up, with the America First Committee sounding the alarm bells the loudest.
The America First Society, which represented a wide variety of political ideologies, from businessmen to Norman Thomas, who was the Socialist Party leader, many Democrats, Charles Lindbergh, put up quite a fight against World War II, against aiding the Allies, and they wanted to build up American defense first. That was their position.
One of the group's most prominent members, Senator Burton K. Wheeler, dispels the alleged air threat posed by Germany.
They suggest that we would suffer an immediate invasion, that panzer divisions would roll down Broadway, and that parachutists would be landing in Montana. How fantastic! How utterly ridiculous! No invader could maintain a supply line from Dakar to South America, or from Berlin to New York. Senator Burton K. Wheeler.
Despite this vocal opposition, the government's rearmament plan is in full swing. Production of military aircraft nearly triples in 1940. 1 year later, it again expands more than 3 times the size, producing nearly 20,000 planes per year. With FDR safely re-elected in 1940, he is free to pursue his plan of arming the Allies without asking for payment up front, due to countries like Britain being on the verge of economic collapse. Known as Lend-Lease, the program eliminates all existing neutrality laws on the books. The United States is now free to supply Britain with as many military goods as they need, including airplanes. As aviation production skyrockets during the first year of this program, there is an uprising from the America First Committee. Its most famous member, the world-renowned pilot Charles Lindbergh, alleges that through aiding Britain, America is now more vulnerable than ever.
To use a specific example, in 1939, we were told that we should increase our Air Corps to a total of 5,000 planes. Congress passed the necessary legislation. A few months later, the administration told us that the United States should have at least 50,000 planes for our national safety. But almost as soon Almost as fast as fighting planes were turned out from our factories, they were sent abroad, although our own Air Corps was in the utmost need of new equipment. So that today, 2 years after the start of war, the American Army has only a few hundred thoroughly modern bombers and fighters. Less, in fact, than Germany is able to produce in a single month.
Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, was the hero of transatlantic flight, a great pioneer. And as the America First debate proceeds in World War II, he's very controversial. He makes some statements in Des Moines, which are widely interpreted as anti-Semitic. He had been awarded a medal by the German government prior to World War II. He's controversial, but he is the linchpin of the isolationist strategy in terms of public debate.
What Lindbergh suspects is true. The United States, through aiding Britain, is hoping to find a backdoor into this conflict. As FDR secretly tells Churchill during the signing of the Atlantic Charter, "I will make war, but not declare it." In the halls of Washington, D.C., battle plans are drawn up.
In the summer of 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt was concerned about what the United States would need by way of strength, manpower, militarily, if it were to end up in a war with Germany. And so he had his leading military officials prepare a report which came to be known as the Rainbow Five Report.
Its contents are strictly classified. In it is America's plans for defeating Nazi Germany. To do this, a wartime army of 8.7 million men is needed. 2 million of them are to be placed into the Army Air Force, comprising 195 groups. Air power is essential, with 64,000 planes required to beat the Germans. This is to be done through the bombardment of their fatherland by planes taking off from both England and the Middle East.
What Rainbow Five did was to enumerate the numbers of ships, the numbers of planes, the numbers of divisions, etc., that would be required in the event we went to war with Germany. The report was considered super secret. Only 35 copies of it were prepared.
Until the logistics of sending millions of soldiers to 2 continents can be worked out, America is on the defense, and the best defense is a good offense.
An effective defense, by its very nature, requires the equipment to attack the aggressor on his route before he can establish strong bases within the territory of American vital interest.
This comes in the form of a long-range bomber. The current planes on order, including the B-17 Flying Fortress, are inadequate. Even the secret B-29 project currently underway at Boeing's many facilities falls short. It must cover a vast distance in order to reach Nazi-occupied Europe from the continental United States. 12,000 miles is desired, a very tall order. The covering of a range that size has never been done before. In addition, a payload of 10,000 pounds is desired. As Germany gains steady ground during most of that year, it looks as if both Britain and the Soviet Union's days are numbered, and if America stands alone, it is going to fight back with a plane possessing a ceiling of 40,000 feet, a 10,000-pound bomb load, and a cruising speed of 300 miles per hour. The right to bid for this new and still yet to be designed superweapon is given to Consolidated, makers of the B-24 Liberator. They begin work on a design that eventually becomes known as the B-36 Peacemaker. Boeing, currently busy with Flying Fortress production, as well as rapidly developing the still unfinished B-29, has enough on their plate. Looking for ideas, both traditional and outside of the box, the government investigates other designs capable of making it to Germany. One possible alternative is presented to the president by Vincent Bernelli, a truly revolutionary designer. Instead of having the engines and landing gear placed next to the aircraft's fuel source, they are instead put above and below. This not only provides greater lift, with both the wings and the body of the aircraft providing elevation, but it is safer for the pilot and crew. His flying wing design seems to be in the lead. Considered the best design by FDR, he invites Bernelli to the White House to discuss it further. Strangely, after the two meet, it is somehow rejected in 1941 despite being strongly endorsed by Air Force General Henry Hap Arnold. Many speculate that it is Bernelli's relationship with Pew, both a financial backer of Wendell Willkie, Roosevelt's opponent for the presidency, and of the American Liberty League, an organization that attempted to plot an overthrow of the president in 1934 that costs Bernelli the contract. Whether true or not, the decision not to back his design ends a possible lucrative career in the aviation business. He instead goes to work for Canadian Car and Foundry, a smaller outfit developing the Loadmaster, a variation of his concept for the civil transport market. Another unconventional designer, Jack Northrop, believes he is the solution based on a variation of the flying wing concept. The entire plane is to be interconnected from wing to tail. This not only increases the plane's speed and lift, but most importantly, it enlarges the bomb load. Northrop is commissioned by the government to pursue testing of this still relatively new technology as part of the Rainbow 5 plan. The final product, taking years to develop, eventually results in the Northrop B-35 bomber, a plane that is so unique and unorthodox it simply blows away aviation experts. The contents of Rainbow 5 are strictly classified. In the public arena, the administration is presenting itself as a party of peace. With the public bitterly divided, Roosevelt campaigned on the pledge not to send any Americans to fight in foreign wars.
In a number of public speeches, he declared that he would not be sending American boys to fight in wars in other parts of the world. But he always added this important caveat, unless we are attacked.
Roosevelt was part of Woodrow Wilson's administration, and he sees what happens to Woodrow Wilson and how Wilson's popularity tumbles. Roosevelt often goes in zigzag ways, and he's zigging and zagging to aid the Allies, not necessarily to get us into war at first, although as things stretch on, you see internal discussions, memos where the Roosevelt administration would like to get us into war, but because of American public opinion, really can't force a declaration of war, and what it does is a series of steps to aid the Allies in all measures just short of war.
He is also being criticized by Republicans, as well as by members of his own party, for provoking war through the use of convoys. If this detailed and specific information gets out, it would have a devastating impact, not only in America, but around the globe.
One of them somehow leaked to the isolationist U.S. senator, a very serious enemy of FDR's, named Burton Wheeler. Burton Wheeler took that secret report and he turned a copy of it over to the Chicago Tribune. The Chicago Tribune was published by a Robert McCormick, who was a staunch anti-Roosevelt publisher. The Chicago Tribune ran that story on its front page under a headline that read, Army War Plan.
Within hours, the entire press, from New York to Los Angeles, is buzzing about this story. The government neither admits nor denies the truthfulness of the report.
Now, this could have been a serious breach of security if it hadn't happened on December 3rd, 1941, just 4 days before this story was obliterated completely by the attack on December 7th by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor.
America is at war. It does not come from the enemy that America wanted to fight, but instead from the enemy they tried to keep at bay. Japan, with their oil supplies cut off by the United States, decides to launch a surprise attack on American naval bases at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 1 day later, President Roosevelt declares war against the land of the rising sun. However, he stops short at declaring war against Germany. After 3 days of consultations between the Germans and Japanese, Hitler declares war against the United States.
American opinion still was not against a war in Europe. We would have attacked or would have fought the people who attacked us and would have wanted to concentrate our resources against Japan. Now, what Adolf Hitler then does is he declares war on us. He didn't have to, and it's one of the fateful mistakes of World War II.
Adolf Hitler, 4 days after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, declared war on the United States. And in doing so, he virtually quoted from this story in the Herald, the Chicago Tribune, because it made clear that the United States was going to attack him, at least in his interpretation, so that by declaring war on the United States, he was in effect anticipating what was already going to be happening.
Finally, Roosevelt has what he wants. Opposition groups, like the America First Committee, evaporate. The American public is solidly behind their president. The United States is now a full-fledged partner in the war both in Europe and the Pacific. As America fights on two fronts, the manifesto of AWPD-1 comes together. Strategic bombing is a central focus of the Allied war machine. In the skies over Germany, flying fortresses and liberators begin pounding the Third Reich into submission.
Bombs away.
In the Pacific, the B-29 is the decisive factor in American victory.
And out of the vast stretches of the Pacific roared the mightiest bomber the Army Air Forces had ever dreamed about. The B-29 Super Fortress, the dust of the Kansas plains still embedded in the shiny silver wings. This was the bomber that was designed to carry the war directly to Japan itself. The zenith of the long-range plans for victory in the Pacific was in sight.
It is air power that is proving pivotal. What was preached during the days of U.S. neutrality is coming to fruition. With both Germany and Japan falling to Allied forces, the United States is now in a position of global dominance, with the European powers being relegated to second-tier status. With the war against fascism over and the war against communism beginning, the bomber plane is vital. One aircraft to emerge in this new Cold War atmosphere is the design originally intended to defend America from the Nazis. The B-36 Peacemaker, with a range of 6,000 miles and a payload of 72,000 pounds, sets the stage for American long-range bombers for the next half-century. When placed next to a B-29 Super Fortress, the Peacemaker shows off its intimidating power. Northrop, evolving the B-35, debuts the jet-powered YB-49 in 1947, to the astonishment of the entire world. With weapons like these, the United States takes the lead in Cold War aviation. At the end of the 20th century, American air power, capable of traveling the longest distances with the largest bomb loads, is second to none. Having two oceans separating it from both fronts, the American psyche grew complacent during the interwar period, taking little interest in European affairs. As Nazi power began to expand, however, that same geographical mindset is what made the United States develop the long-range bomber. Defending the homeland from its own bases proved appealing, and even as America's enemies were defeated, the same principle to be born out of the Second World War remains. The long-range bomber was not a fad, but a long-term strategy to not only provide a smart defense, but also to provide a dominating offense.
This is the consolidated B-36 intercontinental bomber, sometimes referred to as the Peacemaker or the Big Stick. It was the largest conventional warplane ever built. It had tremendous range and a great payload. With its 6 piston engines turning, and later 4 more jets burning, the B-36 for many years projected America's military might.
It was a monstrous airplane. It had 6 engines, and they were pusher props. Now later on they hung jet pods on the ends of the wing, but the early models were were all piston engines pushing. It was a huge airplane, and it was designed then to carry atomic weapons.
But by the mid-50s, its sheer size, cruciform shape, and middling performance worked against it in a world of pure jets. However, in its heyday, the 36 was the very pinnacle of successful giantism. Rather surprising given that a decade and a half earlier, the United States had all but abandoned the idea of operating massive aircraft known as XBLRs, or the Experimental Bomber Long Range. The first attempt, the XBLR-1, resulted in the Boeing XB-15. This was an ambitious and useful experiment that demonstrated the importance of four-engined bombers. The XB-15 carried a crew of 10. However, its 150-foot wingspan proved too large for practical use. But Boeing's next offering, the XB-17, which followed a year later, perfectly met the needs of the Army. Despite the Army Air Force's decision not to proceed with the XB-15, the political mood in 1938 was undergoing a sea change. With the acquisition of total power by the Nazi Party, American military planners had to contemplate a scenario of German domination of Europe, including Britain. In America in 1938, the question being secretly asked was what if Britain did fall? Perhaps the only way of striking back at the Axis powers in Europe was with the once dismissed experimental bomber Long Range. The XBLR-2 came together as the XB-19, somewhat bigger than the XB-15, and in fact bigger than any other aircraft in the world at that time. It was to be built by Douglas Aircraft in California. However, by the time the B-19 first flew, the Battle of Britain had already been won, when a few hundred pilots of RAF Fighter Command were just able to halt the Nazi juggernaut. Notwithstanding these events, the B-19 project continued. Some indication of the project's size can be gained from the scope of its planning. The XB-19 required no less than 4 acres of drawings, 500 engineers, and more than 2 million hours of R&D and construction. The wings on their own had a 212-foot span and were over 1/10 of an acre in actual size. The wings also held 4 giant engines. Each one had more than twice the power of those on the B-15 predecessor. The B-19 even had its own hoists for changing the 16-foot propellers, and was able to lift its own massive engines on and off the wings. Each wing contained a lighted passageway, enabling crew to reach the engines in flight. The 2 massive main towers were 8 foot high, and each was of 24 ply, using 150 miles of rayon cord and 3 miles of steel wire. All of the flying control surfaces were so large that they could only be operated via power-assisted devices. The rudder alone took up an area of 237 square feet of movable surface. To communicate within such a large aircraft, it was necessary to install a 24-set telephone system and a loudspeaker cum fire alarm warning device. And to enable missions of up to 3 days and accommodate at least 13 crew, it was necessary to have a galley, a wardroom, as well as a bunk room. Such were the proportions of what Douglas liked to refer to as their hemispheric defender. In theory, this behemoth flying machine could fly more than 1/3 of the distance around the world without refueling, perhaps reaching parts of Europe and the return trip too. On June 27, 1941, the B-19 made its first flight from Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica to March Air Force Base. Despite various suggestions to the local press at the time, the B-19 was really a proof-of-concept aircraft to explore what could be learnt about building giant aircraft. The B-19 also presented the same problems and lengthy delays as Boeing had endured with its 4-year development of the B-15. Knowing that many of the lessons recently learnt were already becoming obsolete, Douglas suggested that the B-19 be abandoned. However, the Army remained firm that the XBLR-2 would be delivered. In fact, the Douglas Company's view may have been quite sound, as the war had necessitated that the 2 prototype long-range bombers be ordered 6 months before the B-19 ever flew. The Northrop B-35 and its competitor, the enormous consolidated B-36, would use whatever data could be migrated from Douglas. In fact, the B-35's design was a totally different concept, relying upon advanced flying wing aerodynamics to gain maximum range, an idea that was far ahead of its time. Nevertheless, it was the consolidated XB-36 which the Air Force adopted. It was a symbol of pure 1940s giantism, and likely would have benefited from some of the ideas incorporated in the B-19. However, it was a virtual flying gas tank, carrying with it all the fuel it needed for a there-and-back European mission. The Second World War had come and gone before Consolidated's giant reached production, and as Britain did not fall to Germany, the 36's absence had no impact on the conflict, although its presence became critical in the Cold War that followed. It was during this potentially cataclysmic test that America's Peacemaker really came of age. The newly formed Strategic Air Command under General Curtis LeMay would regularly fly to far distant territories just to demonstrate its enormous reach. It was all a very effective show of force, although by the mid-50s, one that was starting to be questioned.
The airplane flew like a glider. It was easy to fly. Anybody could have flown it with 5 hours of stick time. It was a beautiful airplane. It's good that they never had to fly military missions, even with the 4 jet engines which were placed on later.
The success of an earlier Strategic Air Command gamble with the B-47 Stratojet medium bomber demonstrated the need for a faster swept-wing, all-jet-power heavy bomber. Yet Consolidated felt they could still provide a ready answer. The B-60 arrived after a standard 36 fuselage was married to swept wings and tail surfaces. It was propelled by 8 turbojet engines. The concept would have been economical, but advances in in-flight refueling made it no longer necessary for massive fuel loads to be carried. The age of giantism was coming to an end. Strategic Air Command wanted a smaller, faster and more sophisticated heavy bomber, and Boeing's B-52 Stratofortress fitted the bill. And in terms of years of service for dollars spent, the B-52 was able to adapt and evolve in a way Convair's Big Stick never could. Still, credit where it's due. The B-36 was for a number of years America's sole intercontinental bomber and served as an effective deterrent, appropriately earning the type its other nickname, the Peacemaker.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.